Today we're going to tackle the final borders of our summer medallion quilt. It's looking fantastic, and by the end of this video, it's going to be ready for quilting. The cut list for this round includes some background squares, some background rectangles, some yellow pieces, and some blue pieces. Now, there are a variety of ways to assemble the blocks in this round. The first block we need to tackle is the Flying Geese unit, and this is going to be made exactly like in round 2. Was that 2? Yes. You can make these 4 at a time, or if you have some extra from round 2, you can incorporate this into this border because it's the same layout of that yellow center triangle and the background kind of side triangles. So you have your options. The instructions for this round in the printed pattern assume that you're making them 1 at a time. So whichever way you choose to do that, you're going to need 12 flying geese for this round. These large triangle units can be assembled in a variety of ways. The first one we're going to go over is foundation paper piecing, which is exactly the same method we used for our center block. So I'm going to quickly work through the pattern for this block, and then we're going to move on to some new things. The pattern for this block is a little large, so it does come separated onto 2 pieces of paper in the pattern. You're going to need to cut off the margin of 1 page and tape it to its friend. There are lines in the border and the triangle, as well as the star outline, to help you keep it really nice and aligned. Tape is so hard. I also tape that backside so I don't have this kind of flapping around on me. But if you would prefer to save your tape, then save your tape. On all the printout pages for this pattern where there's foundation paper piecing, there are these 1-inch squares, and you want to go ahead and measure those squares kind of before you start sewing, because these guides are there to ensure that your foundation paper piece is going to be an accurate size. So when you print these, you want to be sure to print, I think it's called actual size or no scaling, so that when you go to sew these to its friend block next to it, it's the right size. So I just take my ruler and kind of overlap. You could do this with a smaller ruler instead of this gigantic one I have here. But I just kind of overlap 1 square on the ruler to our 1 square and make sure that it's correct. You can also measure the actual block. From the outside line to the outside line, it should measure 8.5 inches. I am going to take a moment and just pre-fold my paper piece pattern here. And I'm just folding it along until I can see just barely the edge of that line. And that is going to help me make those nice creases so that it'll be easier to fold in the future when I have fabric in the way. So the cutting instructions have you cut 8.5-inch aqua pieces to kind of fill this block. And you could absolutely cut them a little smaller so that you save a little fabric and just cut them triangular shape. But I just cut them square so that I know that I have enough. Now that my 1 segment is pinned in place, I can fold my 2 on that line that we kind of pre-creased in here. I did cut the rectangles for these side units kind of a little closer to size so that I could save a little bit of fabric. They are oversized, so you have plenty of room without being really fussy. So you can see the outline of the dark triangle, and then this outline, you can definitely see it in person, is the kind of outline of my number 2 triangle. So now that that is all aligned, we can flip this back. And then I'm going to sew on this line between 1 and 2. So I'm finally using my gigantic at-a-quarter ruler. I bought it ages ago, and I think I even mentioned it in a video how I never used it because it was so gigantic. But these blocks are pretty big, so I am finally using it. Now we can flip that open. You could press it if you like. My fabric is a little overstarched, if anything, so it's going to make a pretty nice little crease just finger pressing it out. I'm going to repeat that process with my number 3 piece triangle. If you need a refresher for foundation paper piecing, there is a lot of it in the center block video, the very first one in this series. And I also have another longer, more in-depth video on foundation paper piecing. It's on little economy blocks that are super adorable. So I will put links to those in the description below if you need a little bit more help with this process. But I'm going to speed through this, and then we're going to come back and make the same block in a different way. So if you love the accuracy of foundation paper piecing, but you hate ripping papers and you hate taping papers together, then it's time to try foundation paper piecing. I held out on this for a really long time, but once I started it, I really love this technique. It does take a little bit more prep in the beginning, but you will save so much time never ripping out another paper. So this is just regular Reynolds freezer paper. I'm sure that there are other options in your grocery store or Target or wherever you get it. They also make printer size sheets of freezer paper if you want to just print your pattern directly onto this freezer paper. But I have heard that you cannot put it through a laser printer, and that's what I have. It's only for inkjet printers. I guess the heat of the laser printer will melt the waxy coating that is on freezer paper and create a mess for your printer. And I don't want to lose my printer, so I just buy the rolls, and that also saves me from having to tape anything together, since these sheets are quite large. I mean, these sheets are, I think, 17 inches and then kind of 50 feet long or infinitely long. So you can get a really large piece onto your freezer paper and only have to deal with it once. So if you've never used freezer paper before, it is different from parchment paper. Freezer paper has this shiny side and a dull papery side. This shiny side is great because it's a very thin layer of wax, and we are going to use that to our advantage because it will stick to our fabric. But the first thing we need to do is get our foundation paper piecing pattern onto our freezer paper, and there's really no way to do this other than trace, unless you have a different printer than I do. So you can transfer as much or as little of the information from your paper piecing pattern to your freezer paper as you need. I'm going to trace all the lines and make sure I carry over the numbers from my segments. And you just want to trace this without kind of moving the two pieces of paper, between each other. If you wanted to go ahead and kind of trace the outline, then if your paper does shift, at least it will be easy to realign. Now, a couple of things. You do not want to use a friction pen for this because we will be pressing this freezer paper. We will be adding heat to it. And if you use a friction pen, then all of these lines are going to disappear. The other thing is, when you do use regular pen, be sure to wipe off the edge of your ruler. This transfers, and you don't want it to get onto your fabric. So just remember to take oh my goodness. Well, I'm going to have to go wash my hands now. But be sure to take a bleach wipe or a baby wipe or whatever you have handy, and make sure that you clean off your ruler if you do use it to trace with a pen, because you don't want that black ink to transfer your fabric. So now that we have our paper piecing pattern transferred to the paper side of our freezer paper, we need to go ahead and pre-fold the sewing lines on this pattern. Now, I find that freezer paper is a little bit harder to fold than like a newsprint. I think it's the wax coating. You fold it one way and it doesn't necessarily want to fold back the other way. We are also going to be pressing this paper, which for freezer paper really does seem to get rid of even deep creases pretty well. So we have a couple options to make this process faster and easier for us. We are going to perforate the lines that we will eventually sew on. You can do this two ways. You can unthread your sewing machine and simply sew on the lines between 1 and 2 and 1 and 3, and that will poke little holes in the paper and make it really easy to fold on that perforated line. Or if you have one of these, this is for like sewing clothing, and it's a little wheel with little spikes on it. It's kind of like a tiny rotary cutter, but just spikes instead of like a real blade. And they're not terribly sharp, but they're sharp enough to cut through paper. So you can also use this and your ruler here to just make pretty quick work of creating a nice little perforated line. Maybe you can see the holes now with the light coming through them. And that little perforated line makes it really easy to fold on those lines. Or if you don't have one of these, which these are super handy, you can also, like I said, just turn your stitch length to about a 2 and sew on those lines. So we are going to start with our freezer paper the same way we did with our regular foundation paper. We're going to grab our center triangle fabric. So we're going to align our aqua fabric for the center triangle with wrong side to this waxy finish. And then we are going to take this whole thing over to our pressing surface and press this. And here we go. Our blue fabric is very lightly kind of glued to our freezer paper. Now, it's very easy to remove. It just simply peels apart. And we can use that freezer paper to our advantage and not have to pin here. So now that we have our blue aqua center triangle in place and nice and held there, now we're going to fold back this number 2 triangle, and it should crease really nicely on that perforated line that we created. And now it is just like regular foundation paper piecing. We're going to grab our number 2 piece of fabric. Make sure it covers this number 2 piece when it's folded back, and also that we have our seam allowance here. But here's where it departs. We are not going to fold this back and sew on this line. We are going to keep this folded back like this, and we are going to sew next to this line, almost brushing it with our needle. So let's do that. And there's our line of stitching right next to that freezer paper fold. We can fold it back. There's no stitching through it, but our fabric has been secured and seamed. Now we're going to cut off our excess fabric. Now we can fold our freezer paper back and our fabric out and press. And that is going to secure this piece, our new number 2 triangle, to the piece of freezer paper. I haven't noticed a transfer of this wax to my iron in any large amounts, but I do keep my freezer paper patterns fairly covered with fabric when I am pressing them. If you are worried about that transfer because you're using kind of smaller pieces of fabric or there's kind of more of that wax exposed, then you might want to use a pressing cloth between your exposed kind of shiny waxy paper and your iron to protect it. Now that we have our number 2 triangle done, we are going to do that same thing with the number 3. Peel it away from that aqua, and it should just really nicely crease on that perforated line. Grab our number 3 fabric. And again, we're going to sew right next to our freezer paper. If you feel better about sticking a pin kind of in the seam allowance to make the transfer a little easier, then by all means do so. And we're done. Another seam sewn right next to that freezer paper. Now there's a chance that your machine might have some specialty feet that will make this even easier. I believe my Janome has a foot that is kind of like a stitch in the ditch foot, but it's kind of a right next to the ditch foot. So that might be perfect for this kind of application. But I don't have one of those for my Juki, so I am just being very careful and taking it slow. So we're all done. Now, the first time you use this freezer paper, you are going to be cutting your block and the paper. In the future, you're going to be cutting kind of along the paper, but this first time you'll definitely want to use kind of an older rotary cutting blade so you don't dull it on this wax paper. When I trim down my freezer paper pieces, I try to measure out from this kind of interior block line rather than using this exterior line, because as you use this piece of paper over and over, you might kind of slowly shrink this block, and you want to maintain that nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I like to align that 1/4 inch line with that interior block line and cut according to that, rather than trying to line up the edge of my ruler with that outer border cutting line. These first few times, it should obviously be the same, but if I had cut that a little on the edge, like if I had cut that a little slim, you don't want your pieces getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Here is our perfect block. It looks exactly like the one we made with our traditional paper piecing, but here's where the magic is. We can take this freezer paper and just, oh, isn't that so satisfying? And now we can reuse this over and over again. So there was a little bit more prep in the beginning, transferring this to the freezer paper, but now we're ready to sew this again. It is perfect. Our creases are still there because we perforated them, and you can make a whole quilt's worth with one little piece of feature paper. Now, I haven't ever used one of these to the point where the wax paper didn't stick to the fabric anymore. But even if it didn't, you could pin through this and follow the same steps, just sewing along the edge of the fold, or you could use a little bit of like a basting spray just to stick it to your fabric a little bit, or a little bit of fabric glue dots if you're more comfortable with that. Whichever route you go, preserving your paper pattern is really awesome, and it does save you from having to rip out all of those papers at some point in your quilt or having them all get stuck in your seams. So that is 2 methods down, and we have 1 more to go. If you are not into the paper piecing scene, then there is one more way to create these blocks, and it is with rulers. I love specialty rulers. I just kind of collect them. I find them really fascinating, but they are specialty items. If you are only going to make the 8 blocks or whatever it is for this quilt, then this is a pretty hefty investment because it does require 2 rulers. So if you really like this kind of block, and these rulers do make a few variations on them, but I don't know if they're for everybody, but if you happen to have these already, or you are just a ruler person like I am, then let's do it. This is the Creative Grids CGR TMT2 ruler. It is the triangle squared ruler by Karen Montgomery, and we are going to use this to make that center aqua triangle. I already cut my fabric into these squares to use for the other methods. If you are using exclusively these rulers, then you could cut a strip and kind of alternate the direction. So you could cut a triangle here and then flip it and cut a triangle this way to save on your fabric. Mine was already pre-cut though, so I'm just going to cut this triangle out of the square, even though I'm a little tight on the sides. So I cut that by aligning the bottom of my fabric with this 8.5 inch line and then just trimming off the excess. You will also need 2 of these kind of skinny, longer triangles. This is the Perfect Rectangle ruler, also by Karen Montgomery, and these 2 are designed to kind of fit together. And the same thing with this ruler. If I was cutting lots of these, then I wouldn't have these pre-cut triangles. I would cut an 8.5 inch strip and then kind of work down it, kind of rotating this ruler. I have already cut mine, so I'm going to work with what I have. So here are my triangle pieces. Now, if you are using prints for your quilt, then you need to make sure that you cut 2 mirror images of this shape. If you have your fabric already kind of folded from the bolt, then you will kind of naturally end up with 2 mirrored pieces. But if you're cutting it just from a piece of flat fabric, then you'll need to make sure you cut one this way and then one with the wrong side of the fabric up so that you end up with 2 mirror image pieces. And here are our ruler cut pieces. Now, these are going to go together just like a traditionally kind of pieced square. We are going to align our edges. Now, because of the notches on these rulers, they do align really nicely. The little notched edges make it really easy. You don't have to worry about offsetting those kind of angled seams like we have in other patterns. Now that these are aligned, I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam right down here and then press it out, and then we'll be ready to do the other side. Now we have just this last piece, and just like the one before, we are just gonna align it and sew our 1/4 inch seam. Once you are done sewing and pressing that last seam out, then you are done with this block because there's no trimming like there is in the foundation paper piecing methods. So here we go. We have our traditionally pieced with rulers. We have our foundation paper pieced with newsprint, and we have our foundation paper pieced with freezer paper. And they are all identical and interchangeable, so you can pick whichever method you like the best. And if you want to try them all, so you can kind of compare which one you find to be kind of the most accurate or the speediest or the most enjoyable, then this pattern will work for all of them. So whichever method you choose, you are going to need to make 8 of these large triangle blocks. And once you do, then it is time to assemble our side border units. You're going to need 2 of your triangles for each side. You will also need 3 of these Flying Geese units. Now, this is just a regular Flying Goose unit with a 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangle sewn to it. And we do that to kind of bring it up to the same size as these large triangle units, so it's a little easier to sew them together. So you'll need 3 of your Flying Geese units, 2 of your triangle units, and then you will also need 2 more of your 4.5 by 8.5 inch background rectangles, the same ones that we sewed to these Flying Geese units. It's starting to get awfully big to lay out all of the pieces here on my little cutting mat under my cameras, but it goes together like this. You have your 2 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangles that kind of go on the sides, and then you're alternating a Flying Goose unit, a large triangle, Flying Goose, large triangle, Flying Goose. And then on the corners, you have 4 8.5 inch by 8.5 inch square background pieces to kind of act as those little cornerstones. And you are going to assemble this just like you have in the past for these borders. You're going to make 4 identical side border units and then sew them together with the corner pieces and the center that we've been working on like a gigantic 9 patch. Now, as you sew these together, make sure that the blue large triangles are meeting up with those kind of snowball corners from the previous round. And the Flying Geese units should be matching up with the yellow portions of the snowball corner pieces from the previous round, because we want that yellow zigzag look to continue from this first Flying Goose border, kind of zigging up into this border that we're assembling now. We want that yellow zigzag to be really nice and continuous. And that will give you a good reference point and as you're sewing as well to make sure that all those seams are lining up. So I'm going to go ahead and get this border assembled and onto the quilt, and then we can talk about our very last border, which is just some background strips of fabric. So after quite a bit more sewing, I finally finished adding the borders onto this quilt. Now this is our last piece border, and I think the quilt looks great right now as is. It currently measures 64 inches square, so you could absolutely stop right now and quilt it, bind it, and it's done. I would like to add a little bit more kind of space around the points the points of this quilt so that I have a little bit more room to do some negative space quilting and quilt in the borders, which I really enjoy doing. So I'm going to add a border, and this border is included in the pattern. We are going to add a 3-inch border all the way around the quilt. And this is where you have some room to really adjust the sizing of this quilt. Our quilt is currently 64 inches square. These 3-inch borders on all sides bring it up to 70 inches square. But if you want a bigger quilt, then you can just adjust the borders right here. If you would like for this quilt to be 80 by 80, then you need then you would need to put an 8-inch border on each side of the quilt. So 64 inches plus that 16 inches divided by 2 of the border is 8 inches on each side. And to do that, you would need to cut 8.5-inch fabric strips. So I have my little bundle of 3.5-inch by width of fabric strips here. Now, obviously, 64 inches is longer than our width of fabric, so we are going to need to piece these border pieces together. I'm going to go ahead and sew all of my strips together to just make the cutting a little bit more efficient. Once I have all of these sewn together into one long strip, then I will cut 2 64.5-inch lengths and sew those to 2 opposite sides of the quilt, either side and side or top and bottom. And then I will cut 2 70.5-inch lengths of this 3.5-inch strip and sew those to the opposite sides. So it will go together like this. You just want to make sure that those 2 longer borders are enough to cover the width of the border that you're adding. If you choose to make this border wider, then those measurements will not be exact for you. You will need to pause and measure your quilt sides or do the math to make sure that you're cutting long enough lengths. You may also need to cut additional widths of fabric to make up for that additional border. So you're going to need possibly more fabric than is what is called for in the written pattern. Another way you could add to this quilt is by using all of these little half square triangles that we saved from our piecing. I don't know how many are here, but it's quite a lot. You could press these open and trim them all to a consistent size and sew them together and possibly make a pieced border out of them. It may not be enough to go all the way around, but you could do something like this, where you have 2 corners that are pieced and then have the rest solid strips. Or you could come up with some kind of other arrangement that you find pleasing. If you don't want to use these on the front, you could also piece these half square triangles together and use it in your backing fabric. Or what I might do is sew these together to make kind of a corresponding mini quilt or some pillow covers. So I'm going to go ahead and do the work of attaching these final borders, and then when we come back, our quilt top will be complete. After I put the final borders on my quilt, I did go ahead and begin the quilting. I took the diagram from the pattern and imported it to my iPad and spent quite a lot of time drawing out some options for this quilt. I have been doing a lot of all-over quilting lately since I got a computer system on my long arm, but I had a little bit more time with this quilt, and so I decided to kind of indulge myself and have a lot of fun with the quilting here. So I ended up deciding upon kind of this arrowhead zigzag shape, some straight lines, and some pebbles. And I just repeated those elements in different areas of this quilt to give it a uniform look that really accentuates kind of that yellow frame around the center star and just kind of makes the whole thing feel like it's kind of shiny. I ended up doing a kind of crackle shattered background in the navy, and there I was really just looking for some texture because I wanted the yellow and aqua parts to be the focus of the quilt and the quilting. So I wanted that navy to just kind of fade into the background. And I think the crackle look kind of just gives you like a really amazing texture. I used a really puffy batting on this quilt, and I think that that really helps make the less quilted areas, like that middle stripe of the yellow zigzag and the frame, really pop out and be really prominent. I hope you guys enjoyed this series as much as I did. It was a lot of fun to take kind of a bigger project than I have done in the past on the channel and break it up into chunks to make it a little bit more manageable for all of us. And I really love the end result. I think it's exactly what I was looking for. And when I was making the diagrams initially to come up with a pattern, I think the end result looks just how I imagined it would. So going forward, I hope to incorporate a lot more scrappy projects into kind of the channel lineup because I know you guys love scrappy projects and I love scrappy projects. So I have kind of the next few months planned out and I am really excited about them. So I hope you join me. And if you want to be notified of future videos, be sure to subscribe with the little red button somewhere down here. And it will make me kind of pop up on your YouTube channel when you log in. And until then, I hope you guys have an amazing week and happy quilting. Oh, and I cut mine a little small, didn't I? Whoops. This is a... What is this called? That doesn't even write. Paper, your printable pattern. Print pattern, wow. And I never have pins here. I never have pins. Why am I like this? Let me get some pins.